scandalized I hadn't picked a more Western dress. It was imported silk, embossed with tiny flowers, edged with satin pipe, and closed with knotted cloth buttons. It was everything a ball gown should be, a Cinderella dress, but a Chinese Cinderella in flat silk slippers. I wore jeans and sneakers to school every day, but for this one night I wanted to be a princess. I think I knew the prom was no place for me, so the only way to do it was to become someone else. Chinese Cinderella danced with all the boys and made all the girls give her funny looks. I didn't find a Prince Charming. I was not surprised. I had bought the double-breasted suit in San Francisco, where the tailor seemed unfazed that a woman wanted a man's suit tailored to her. I stood looking at myself in the mirror, resisting the urge to Napoleon my hand between the two wide buttons. I'd gotten my hair cut that morning, and it seemed like a stranger, or maybe a long-lost brother, stared back at me from the glass. I'd been in San Francisco for a week at that point, and I was losing hope of finding Jin there. I had been trying to make friends with the other whores so I could ask around if anyone had seen her, but it was difficult to make friends with these women who were, by and large, closely guarded by their men and who knew very little of the outside world. I could not become one of them, and it took me too long to gain their trust. I needed a faster way to go from house to house, and it was overhearing the bragging of some Taiwanese businessmen about how many whores they could see in a night that gave me the idea to impersonate them. In the mirror, my twin smiled. When I first met Jin, I thought she was the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen. That is, she was the most beautiful woman I had ever seen, and I wasn't even conscious enough of the thought to know that I had thought it. It was only later when I began to realize what my thoughts were, as she occupied more and more space in my head. My poor, overworked brain, all crammed with women's studies classes and contradictory politics and comparative literature. When I arrived at the restaurant to begin my evening's work, I would forget it all. Jin's hands were soft as they brushed my hair and pinned it into place as they buttoned my silk-embroidered bar hostess dress. Each night, she transformed me from an overworked college student into something more elegant, but she herself never changed. When I first came to work for Skinny, I had an idea in the back of my mind that I would fool people into thinking I was something I was not. My mother was ashamed of the restaurant side of the family and had raised me to be as American as apple pie. But when I was 15, I had learned I came from the mainland. I began to undo that any way I could. I tried to teach myself to read Chinese, and I failed. When I went to college, I tried again and succeeded. But I thought it was too late. It was too late to be who I was meant to be. When I took the Chinese restaurant job, it was one more stab at grabbing a piece of the life I felt I had missed. But fate takes care of these things. And upstairs in Skinny's restaurant, I found a true piece of the past waiting for me, like a piece of jade buried in a box of silk.
You're going to want to read the rest of that story. Okay, so, and that was from That's by Short Stories. Okay. So, next I'm bringing up Maryanne Mohanraj. Her book is The Stars Change, a very complex sci-fi tale, and she's like the head of 2 organizations. She's a keynote speaker for the Because Conference, which is an annual bisexual conference in Minnesota? Minneapolis. Well, that's in Minnesota. Okay, so please come on up and tell us a little bit about your book, and see your reading.
Thank you, Sheila. It's lovely to be here. I live in Chicago, so I don't get to New York very often. It's great that this event is happening. So I wrote erotica for about 10 years in my 20s, and then in my 30s I mostly wrote mainstream lit. a lot of stuff about Sri Lanka and sort of immigrant fiction. You know, my last book, Bodies in Motion, I called The Droiler Club, but with Sri Lankans. So I think back. I tend to tell very interrelated stories with lots of characters who show up in each other's stories, which is, I guess, what Sheila called my book complex, but it's very thin. I would say it's not that complex. And I've returned to sort of my childhood love of science fiction and have really been enjoying it. But the book takes place a few hundred years from now, vaguely, on a South Asian settled planet where the South Asians have built a university, because that's what we do. The conflict in the story has to do not with really race or sexuality, both which are topics that people have sort of relaxed about in the future. But there are humans that are sort of advocating for pure humanity. There are genetically modified humans, and there are lots of aliens. So, and the book takes place on the night that the first interstellar war has just been declared, and a missile has it hits the warren, which is sort of the alien ghetto on this planet. So, and I don't know what you know about Sri Lanka, but Sri Lanka had a 30-year civil war. And technically it's over, but that's a whole other topic. So, all right. And I'm just going to read a little bit from this. It's mostly not a funny book. I'm sorry, but I tried to find a vaguely funny bit. All right. And this is partway into a story. This is my gay lizard cop story. So he, his name is Gaurav. He got stranded on this planet. At the start of the story, he's patrolling the university grounds, and he sees this large cat woman having sex with a human in the middle of the night. I mean, war's just been declared, and people are kind of freaking out, right? So she's having sex in the park. So, all right. Gaurav would have liked to go to university, but he wasn't smart enough to get in. Thick as a brick, Captain Raj used to say. Gaurav was built like a brick too, bigger and stronger than most humans. Big and strong were advantages for a cop. He was slower moving than the captain would have liked, but most days, all that a campus cop needed to do was loom in a threatening manner, so Gaurav did okay. Looming, waiting for something better to come along. He'd just been marking time until Chris arrived, forcibly retired from the real force at 80, but still too energetic, too passionate to spend his days knitting at home. Energetic enough to still do extra training and harass him into doing it too, until Gaurav could almost keep up with him. Passionate enough to drag his bewildered partner into bed on occasion, and hadn't that been a surprise? The first time, Gaurav had been in the patrol car at the end of a long shift, complaining. You just don't understand how hard it is, being the only Saurian on the planet. He was a whiny brat back then, 2 years on the job and technically an adult, but with too many habits of adolescence. Oh, I'm sure you're not the only one. It's a big planet, Chris answered absently, his eyes fixed on the screen, scanning the readouts for trouble. The only one I've seen in 3 years, Gaurav sighed. If I don't get back home, it's going to shrivel up and fall off. That got Chris to turn to face him. Finally. Do they do that? He asked. No, not really. It's an expression. Didn't humans know anything about any species other than their own? Chris raised a slender eyebrow. Maybe you should go visit a professional. Some of them are quite open-minded. There's one down on Iskander Road. Gaurav shook his head. He wasn't that desperate. Not yet. A funny, slow smile slid across Chris's face. Too proud to pay for it, huh? Well, maybe a man could help a lizard out. And that was when Chris reached out, across the flyer's gear shift, and put his hand on him. Right there. Gaurav almost crashed the damn machine. Gaurav had known even then that humans would look askance at their mutual gratification. For one thing, they didn't seem to approve of large age differences between sexual partners, and Chris was almost 60 years older than he was. But Gaurav